Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and today we're taking a look at a pistol that is not in any way forgotten. This is the M1911A1, the standard US service pistol of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and everything thenceforth until 1985, when it's ultimately replaced by the Beretta 92. However, I think there are a lot of nuances and interesting elements to the 1911 during World War II that a lot of people aren't really all that familiar with. So we're going to take a closer look at this one today. The US had just barely adopted the 1911 when the First World War broke out. And when the US entered the First World War, it ramped up 1911 production as much as it possibly could. In fact, the government was in the process of trying to scale it up even further when the war ended in 1918. And in total, the US had manufactured about 643,000 M1911 pistols during that war. During the course of the war, a number of ideas came up for modifications to make to the pistol, but there wasn't an imperative to change the gun during the war, and even after the war, well, the US had a ton of these pistols and didn't really need to make a whole lot more of them. So these changes would eventually comprise the model of 1911A1, and the first batch of 10,000 were ordered from Colt in 1924 and delivered, but then it wouldn't be until 1938 that another batch were made, and it was only in 1938 that they were formally designated the M1911A1, and another batch of 10,000 were ordered and manufactured by Colt. Now, just thereafter, in 1939, the US government started issuing bids for what it called educational contracts for the 1911, as well as, by the way, for rifles and machine guns. And the idea here was an educational contract was the US government would pay a company essentially to build the tooling and the production line for a gun, and then stash all of that material in its warehouse somewhere and just sit on it in case it was needed. Late 1930s, you don't have to be Einstein to predict that maybe a war is coming. And so educational contract bids were put out to 7 different companies. Some of the classic gun companies, Winchester, Ithaca, H&R, as well as non-gun companies like the Singer Sewing Machine Company and a couple of adding machine companies, like office supply companies as well. And ultimately, only 2 of these companies would actually follow through and be awarded an educational contract. And that was a contract to make a mere 500 guns. But making those 500 required building the whole production line and essentially proving it out by making 500 guns on the production line. Now, these 2 were H&R, Harrington Richardson, classic longtime gun company, and Singer, the sewing machine company. And interestingly, H&R failed. They were behind schedule. They weren't able to, ultimately they produced no complete pistols, and the contract, the educational contract for them, was canceled in the summer of 1942. Singer produced its 500 guns very effectively. The quality was very nice. Everyone was very happy with them. But by the time full-scale contracts were being issued for real production of the pistols, the Singer company's facilities were already pretty well occupied by making other things. In particular, M5 artillery directors, essentially artillery cannon sighting systems, which Singer was also making, and those were a substantially higher priority than pistols. Pistols were, like, the US government wanted a lot of them, but they were a pretty low priority project. Everything in the various ordnance districts was rated on a priority scale, and the higher priority stuff got first access to things like steels that were needed and various allocated resources. So there is, by the way, this rumor that Singer's pistols were too good and the factory was wasted on making pistols, so they gave them something complicated instead. It didn't actually work that way. Singer's guns were fine, but they weren't particularly anything better than, say, Colts or Springfields. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Singer makes its 500 guns, but then never gets a full-on contract. In 1942, in the spring of 42, the US is now at war, and the day of educational orders has kind of passed. Now it's not, we want you to sit on this tooling in case we need it. Now it's, well, we need it right now. So they went straight to, let's bid some contracts for full-scale production of 1911 pistols, specifically 1911A1s, because that was the standard new pattern at this point, even though it had only just been introduced, or just been first produced, right before the war. So 3 new companies get contracts to make 1911s. They are the Ithaca Gun Company, which had failed to get an educational order, but it did get a full-on order at this point. the Union Switch and Signal Company, which had made railroad goods, and Remington Rand. Now, this pistol we have here is a Remington Rand. And first off, I want to point out that this isn't the Remington Gun Company. It was originally founded by the same people, but long before World War II, the company split. And you had the Remington Firearms Making Company, and then you had the Remington Typewriter Company. The Remington Typewriter Company merged with the Rand Codex Company that made other office supplies in 1927 and formed Remington Rand. That's the company that got the pistol contract. The Remington Gun Company was making other military stuff. This was a typewriter factory. In fact, specifically, the company had its C division factory set up in Syracuse, New York, that had previously been used for both warehousing and making typewriters, but it had been vacant since 1939. So, spring of 1942, Remington Rand retools this 7-story factory building to make 1911 pistols. Now, it wouldn't be until November of 42 that they actually got the first ones delivered to the military. There was some time involved in getting their tooling set up. It's interesting, they got a bunch of tooling from Springfield. Springfield Armory's purpose as a national armory was in large part to produce tooling so that it could be handed off to civilian companies in case of war. And so they got a bunch of that. That was the purpose of Springfield. They also got a bunch of the tooling from Singer and from H&R, stuff that had been built but then not actually needed. But it still wasn't super quick to set up production. There were some interesting little things, like the Remington engineers complained that the drawings from Singer had a bunch of symbols that were unique to Singer's engineering department, and they had to like go in and try and decipher what the meaning of various things on the engineering drawings were. They didn't have all of the jigs and fixtures and tooling that they needed. There was a bit of trouble taking Springfield's jigs and fixtures and making them work on other machines, and at any rate, this took some time, and it wasn't until November that the first guns come off the line. By the way, Remington Rand had a pretty good tool shop. They were able to make pretty much all of the stuff that they needed for this production line on their own, and it was good enough that they also either made or sourced a lot of the tooling for Ithaca's production. Ithaca didn't have a tool shop with a lot of capacity to do this sort of setup work. So Remington supplied a bunch of it to them. Ithaca was apparently constantly concerned that Remington was going to cheat them in some way, or, you know, we're only going to get the dregs and Remington's going to keep the good stuff for themselves, which doesn't appear to have happened, but it was a little frosty between the two companies. At any rate, full-scale production begins late in 42. Remington Rand would continue producing 1911s until June of 1945. They were the first main company of these three to have the last of their contracts ended. In total, Remington Rand produced 877,715 1911A1 pistols during World War II, that making up a significant portion of the 1.9 million that were manufactured overall. And by the way, that 1.9 million was enough that after 1945, there was never any more military 1911 production. That provided enough pistols for all branches of the US military to be sufficiently supplied until 1985, when this was replaced by the Beretta 92. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at this. Let me show you some of the features specific to World War II production and the changes from the 1911 to the 1911A1. Let's start by looking at the differences between the 1911 and the 1911A1. These are basically ergonomic changes almost across the board. There's really no mechanical difference between the guns. It's just making them fit the hand and making them fit the hand better and improving the sights. So first off, the trigger itself on the 1911, it is fairly long, it is smooth-faced, and you've got this solid frame on the outside. The A1 is looking to make the trigger a little bit easier to reach for people with shorter fingers or smaller hands. So they have checkered the trigger face, they've shortened the trigger itself, and they've added this scallop cut on both sides that allows your finger to sort of get a little bit more distance in, so easier to reach the trigger. The original 1911 was made with a flat mainspring housing right here. The 1911A1 has an arched mainspring housing, and this was done to support the inside of the hand a bit better, change the grip angle a little bit, and give a more comfortable grip on the gun. This is one of those things that I think 1911 connoisseurs and devotees will argue back and forth over which is better. However, what almost no one will argue about is the fact that when they extended the tang here on the back of the grip safety, you can see It's pretty short on the 1911. It is noticeably longer here on the A1. That is a good thing because that helps prevent the hammer from coming in and biting the back of your hand if you have a nice high grip. On the original 1911, just right there, you will get what's called hammer bite, and you can get a nice little red blood blistery welt from the hammer if you have a good high and tight grip on the gun, which is something that we prefer these days. And lastly, the sights were made larger. So we have a pretty narrow front sight on the 1911, a bit wider one on the A1, and then the same is true on the rear sights. Narrow on the 1911 and wider on the A1. The sights on the 1911 A1 are quicker, easier to pick up, easier to use. Now let's take a look at the markings here. We have in very simple script, Remington Rand Incorporated, Syracuse, New York, USA. You will also find 4 other manufacturers from World War II era. The other 2 major companies that I mentioned, Ithaca and Union Switch and Signal, as well as Springfield Armory and Colt, who had manufactured the guns back in World War I as well. Now, on Remington, they made complete guns as well as replacement parts. On the complete Remingtons, there's nothing on the right side of the slide. However, their replacement slides were marked model of or M1911A1. So if you find a gun that has 1911A1 marked on the slide and it's Remington, that means it's a replacement slide. Down on the frame, we have a number of other things. This one, I believe, has been re-blued or reparkerized when it was refurbished after the war, but we've got United States property. Serial number is 2.38 million. In total, Remington would get 6 contracts for 1911s, and each contract came with a serial number block. So they didn't make all their guns starting from 1 going up to their total of 877,000. They had specific blocks assigned. Interestingly, there was a little bit of whoopsie going on at some points during the war, and there were a couple serial number blocks that were actually duplicated and issued to multiple companies. So if you find a gun with an A suffix after the serial number, that indicates that it's a gun whose serial number had been duplicated, and after the war they gave it that suffix to differentiate it. Anyway, we also have M1911A1 US Army. Here we have an Ordnance Department crossed cannon stamp back here. That's the final Ordnance Department approval mark, taking the gun into military possession and service. On this side, down on the frame, we have, this one's not quite completely stamped, but that is FJA, and those are the initials of Frank J. Atwood, Lieutenant Colonel. He was the Chief Ordnance Inspector for the Rochester Ordnance District. He was in charge of inspecting pistols that came out of Remington Rand. Different companies in different parts of the country would have different inspector initials on them. Now, a lot of the parts on the pistol were subcontracted. Remington Rand made all the biggest pieces, especially the slides and the frames, in-house in Syracuse, but they actually subcontracted some of the small parts to other Remington organizations in places like Elmira, New York, and Ilion, New York, Ilion being the location of the famous Remington gun factory. Barrels were manufactured mostly by High Standard, as well as some being made by the Springfield Armory. Those companies already had production setups to make barrels, and it was easier to have them also make 1911 barrels than to set up companies like Remington and Ithaca and Union Switch and Signal to make their own barrels. So springs were outsourced, the plastic grips were outsourced, the magazines were actually outsourced, and we have a little R, and there it is, on the toe of this magazine. That doesn't actually mean Remington. That means that this magazine was made by the Risden Tool and Machine Company. So a lot of outsourcing for components just to keep production as efficient as possible. So disassembly is remove the slide stop pin. We can then pull the slide off the frame. Take out the barrel bushing, take out the spring plunger. We take out the barrel. Here on the barrel lug, we have an HS. That indicates that this was a barrel made by High Standard, as opposed to any of the other companies who would indicate with their own initials. The finish on virtually all the World War II 1911A1s is zinc phosphate, is parkerizing. Parkerizing, by the way, is actually a trademark brand name, kind of like Kleenex or Escalator, that became a catch-all for its actual process. So it's actually zinc phosphate. It is a quick and fairly easy finish to apply. It's pretty durable, and it has this gray to gray-green dull look to it. This is not the fancy commercial Colt finish of the 19-teens or the 1920s. For what it's worth, Remington Rand was pretty good at this. Their first contract for the pistols came in at a price of $39.93. By 1945, by their last contract, they had dropped that price to $23.92 per gun, which was actually like $10 a gun less than Colt. They had managed to pay for all of the factory setup, getting production underway, and they were making these guns very cheap and efficient, but still to a high quality standard, fully interchangeable with all the other manufacturers, and no real complaints. By the end of World War II, of course, the US has a massive supply of 1911A1 pistols. They do look at whether the pistol should be replaced. There's in particular a look at the German P38 because it's got a double action trigger. So you don't have to carry it cocked and locked if you want it immediately accessible. Just that double action trigger is really an easier way to have a gun safely carried very much immediately ready to use. And the determination was the double action system is good, and it should definitely be considered when other conditions require the US to adopt a new pistol. But by itself, it doesn't warrant replacing the 1911. 45 caliber was seen as a very good thing for this pistol, one of its key qualities. It was intended to be a potent short-range pistol. And there were concerns about 9mm being insufficiently powerful for the purpose of the gun. We'll talk about that sort of stuff in a separate video. But anyway, as fate would have it, they did adopt a double action when they replaced the pistol. It just wouldn't be for another 40 years after World War II. They did rebuild a bunch of these guns, primarily the Rock Island Arsenal. Rebuilt guns, replaced parts where necessary, reparkerized the guns, refinished them. You will find Army issue, like actually a lot of Army issue guns that are mismatched, that have parts from different manufacturers. You'll find slides and frames from different mismatched manufacturers. And a lot of that came from the rebuilding process, where they didn't try to match original manufacturers. The whole point of having production standards is that all your parts interchange between everybody who's making the guns. So this one still has all of its original parts, which is pretty cool. The US would sell something like 150,000 1911s between 1958 and 1969 through the Department of Civilian Marksmanship. And in fact, this is one of those DCM sale guns, and I have the original sale paperwork for this gun. Let me show that to you. So here it is. This is a pretty cool piece of documentation, actually. We have the Rock Island Ordnance Depot in Illinois. This is the name of the guy who actually purchased the gun. I'm not really worried about his identity because this was done in 1960, so this is 80 years old, and he is almost certainly dead now. There's a nice bit of description and disclaimer here. This is a bill of sale. It's evidence of lawful transfer of the gun. You won't get arrested for having it. Kind of funny that they actually mistranscribed the serial number because this is 238-1715. And on the paper it has 288-1715, but it's clearly this same gun. Interestingly, the guns were written off officially as unserviceable so that they could be sold as surplus. This is, in fact, a like-new out of refurb 1911. And the cost here was $14.15 plus $2.85 for packing and handling for a grand total of $17 when it was purchased from the US government. Needless to say, they are not so cheap anymore. And for what it's worth, here's the box that it came in. Conveniently labeled. It contains one pistol automatic caliber 45 M1911A1, and originally came with 2 magazines, although it only has one now. It's just a simple box, some wax paper to protect the gun, and there you go. That's how guns get packed. Hopefully you found that to be a pretty decent overview of the 1911 in World War II. I particularly like the contrast between the World War I guns. They're very much this very nice Colt commercial blued standard fancy handgun to the World War II guns, where they very quickly went to quick and efficient parkerizing, a dull, rough parkerized finish, plastic grips. It's a no frills gun. It's the same basic design, but 2 very different expressions of the pistol between World War I and World War II. So anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.